The morning I found out, I was sitting at my kitchen table in Kelowna with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. I remember staring at my laptop screen, reading the same line 3 times before it actually registered. My checking account, source, my savings. The line of credit I had never once touched in 32 years, maxed. I did not panic. That surprised me later, how calm I felt in that first moment. I just sat there looking at those zeros and I thought, she actually did it. My son-in-law had been talking about this wedding for nearly 2 years. Not my daughter, him. Every family dinner, every phone call, every holiday gathering where we sat around my table, eating the same honey-glazed ham my wife used to make, he would bring it up. The venue they had found in West Kelowna, the catering, the imported flowers, the photographer who charged more per hour than I used to make in a day at the credit union. And each time my daughter would look at me with those eyes, her mother's eyes, and I would smile and say something like, "Sounds wonderful, sweetheart, because what else do you say?" My wife Helen passed 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She was 61 years old and she had never been sick a day in her life before that. And then she was gone so fast it felt like the world had skipped a page. My daughter was with me every day of those 11 weeks. She slept on the couch in the hospital room. She held her mother's hand and sang to her quietly when Helen stopped being able to speak. In those months I thought I understood who my daughter was down to the bone. I was wrong. Or maybe I wasn't wrong about who she was then. Maybe grief does things to people that they can't always undo. Her name is, I'll call her my daughter, because even now, saying her name out loud feels like pressing on a bruise that hasn't healed right. She met her now husband about 18 months after Helen died. He was charming in the way that some people are charming, effortlessly, automatically, like breathing. He sold real estate in the Okanagan, and he always seemed to know things. Which restaurants had just opened, which neighborhoods were about to turn over, which wines were worth drinking. My daughter fell hard and fast, and I told myself that was okay. She deserved to be happy. She had earned it. What I didn't see, what I should have seen looking back, was the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. At the dinner table, at Christmas, at the little birthday gathering we had at the house on the lake. He was calculating something. I know that now. At the time I thought he was just sizing me up the way men sometimes do with their girlfriends' fathers. Trying to figure out where he stood. What he was actually figuring out was what I was worth. I had worked at the same credit union in Kelowna for 31 years. Branch manager for the last 14. I wasn't wealthy by any meaningful definition of the word, but I had been careful. Helen and I had been careful together. We had the house on Lakeshore Road paid off. We had a rental property in Penticton that brought in steady income. We had retirement savings, a TFSA, an RRSP that we had been feeding since our 30s. We were in the quiet and unglamorous way of people who grew up without much secure. About a year ago, I had a small health scare, my heart. Nothing catastrophic, a flutter, an irregular rhythm they caught during a routine checkup, a week of tests and specialist appointments, and a lot of sitting in waiting rooms reading outdated magazines. I recovered completely. But during that week, my daughter came to stay with me, and one evening she asked me something that seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable. "Dad," she said, "have you thought about what happens to everything if something goes wrong? Like, legally? Do you have someone who can manage things if you can't?" I told her I had a will. I told her the lawyer who handled it had been a friend of mine for 20 years. She nodded slowly. "But what about right now? Like if you were in the hospital and bills needed to be paid, or decisions needed to be made. Wouldn't it be easier if I had power of attorney, just as a precaution? I want to be clear about something." I hesitated. There was a moment, a real moment, where something in me paused. I knew what a power of attorney meant. I had spent 31 years in financial services. I had counseled clients about exactly this kind of document, the weight of it, the trust it required. I knew. And then I looked at my daughter who had slept on a hospital couch for 11 weeks to be near her dying mother. And I said yes. The paperwork was drawn up quickly. Her fiancé recommended the lawyer. I didn't think much of that at the time. 3 months later I got a phone call. I was out on the back deck deadheading the roses. Helen's roses, the ones she had planted along the fence the summer before she got sick, when my phone rang. My daughter's voice was bright and fast, the way it gets when she's nervous about something. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen before you say anything." I put down my shears. The venue deposit was due and we didn't have enough in our account, and we couldn't get a loan approved in time, and I used the power of attorney. "I moved some money from your savings. We're going to pay it back, I promise. It was just a temporary thing." "How much?" I asked. A pause. $60,000. I had been standing in my backyard in the Okanagan sunshine looking at my late wife's roses, and my daughter had just told me she had moved $60,000 out of my account without asking me. "I'll call you back," I said, and I went inside. I checked the account. She had moved the money 3 weeks earlier. I had missed it. I hadn't looked carefully at the statements because I trusted her. Because I was her father, and she had her mother's eyes, and she had slept on that hospital couch, and I had trusted her completely. I should have stopped it there. I know that. I should have revoked the power of attorney that same afternoon, called my lawyer, made it clear that what she had done was not acceptable under any circumstances. I should have treated it the way I would have treated it if a client had come to me with the same story. But I called her back, and I let her talk, and she cried, and she told me how much stress she'd been under, and how her fiancé's parents weren't contributing anything to the wedding, and how she had just needed to get through the deposit deadline, and she would pay me back by the end of the summer, she promised. I told her she should have asked me. I told her she could not do that again. I told her I forgave her. I thought that was the end of it. 3 months after that conversation, I came home from a fishing weekend up at Maple Lake. Just 3 days, just me and 2 old friends from the credit union, to find a voicemail on my phone. It was from my daughter. Her voice was not nervous this time. It was flat, steady, almost businesslike. Dad, I need you to know that the wedding is next Saturday. We needed more money, and I've taken care of it. I used the power of attorney to clear out the savings and the RRSP, and I also signed the paperwork to sell the Penticton property. I know you're upset, but this is my wedding and I needed to make it happen. I'll call you when things have settled down. I listened to that message standing in my kitchen, still holding my fishing rod case. I played it a second time, then a third. She had cleared my retirement savings. She had sold the rental property in Penticton. My rental property, a piece of property I had owned outright for 16 years, that I had bought with Helen, that we had repainted ourselves over a long weekend with bad coffee and old music on a borrowed radio. She had sold it. She had signed my name to papers and sold it, and then she told me not to call until things settled down. The total was somewhere around $240,000. I sat down at the kitchen table and I did not cry and I did not call anyone. I just sat there for a long time in the quiet of the house, Helen's house, our house, and I thought about all the ways I had been a fool. Then I made one phone call, not to my daughter, not to the lawyer. I called Derek, who had been my closest friend for 40 years, and who had, before he retired, been one of the best fraud investigators in the province. I told him what happened. I told him about the power of attorney, the withdrawn funds, the sold property. I told him about the fiancé, the rushed lawyer, the charming smile at dinner. Derek listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. James, he said, that's my name, James Holbrook. What exactly do you know about this man she's marrying? I realized sitting there that I knew almost nothing. I knew his name. I knew he sold real estate. I knew he was charming. Derek said he'd make some calls. What he found over the next 4 days was not something I was prepared for. My son-in-law-to-be had been married before, twice. The first wife lived in Calgary and had, 7 years ago, filed a civil suit against him for misappropriation of shared financial assets. The case had been settled quietly, the terms sealed. The second wife was in Halifax. She had not filed anything, but Derek had a contact who knew her, and the story she told was familiar. A relationship that moved fast, an engagement, financial decisions made during the engagement that she hadn't fully understood until it was over. He was not a real estate agent who happened to be charming. He was a man who had built a life around finding women, and apparently, their families, who could be maneuvered into positions of financial vulnerability. My daughter was not a villain in this story. She was a grieving woman who had lost her mother and fallen in love with someone who knew exactly which doors to walk through. That didn't change what she had done to me, but it changed how I understood it. I did not go to the wedding. I did something that was much harder. 3 days before the ceremony, I walked into the RCMP detachment in Kelowna, and I spoke to an officer in the financial crimes unit. I brought every document I had. The power of attorney, the account statements, the property transfer records, Derek's notes on my son-in-law's history. I sat across from that officer for 2.5 hours and I told him everything. He told me that what my daughter had done, even with the power of attorney, exceeded the scope of the document. A power of attorney for personal care and routine financial management does not grant the right to liquidate a person's retirement savings or sell their real property without explicit authorization. The lawyer who had drafted and witnessed those property transfer documents had either been negligent or complicit. Either way, there was a case. He also told me that the information about my son-in-law's prior history, combined with the pattern of behavior in our situation, was something they would want to look at more carefully. I drove home and I sat in Helen's garden for a long time. The wedding happened without me. I heard about it later. 140 guests, a venue on the water, a reception that apparently went until 2 in the morning. My daughter called me that night after midnight and I didn't answer. She called 3 more times over the next week. I didn't answer those either. I wasn't ready. and I needed to let the process work without interference from me. What happened over the following 8 months was slow and sometimes brutal, and I would be lying if I said there were not nights when I regretted all of it. The investigation moved forward. My son-in-law's prior history made him a person of interest not just in my case but in a broader pattern the RCMP had been building for some time. He was not, it turned out, some small-time opportunist. He was careful, and he had done this before, and he had been very good at not getting caught. He was not good enough. He was arrested on a Tuesday morning in February. I know because the officer called me before it was in the news. Fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, and several charges related to the pattern across multiple provinces. His bail conditions meant he could not contact my daughter or leave British Columbia pending trial. My daughter called me that afternoon, crying so hard I could barely understand her. I answered this time. She said she hadn't known. She said she had believed everything he told her, that the money was being managed properly, that the property sale was something I had agreed to before the fishing trip, that all of it was above board. She said he had told her I was getting forgetful, that I had started making decisions that weren't in my best interest, that she was protecting me by acting while she still could. That last part hit me like something physical. He had told her I was losing my mind. He had framed the power of attorney not as a convenience for me but as a rescue operation for a father who was declining. And my daughter, still deep in grief, still desperate to hold on to the people she had left, she had believed him. I sat with the phone to my ear for a long time without saying anything. "Did you know the property sold?" I finally asked her. A silence. "Yes. Did you know the RRSP was cleared?" Another silence. "He said you had approved it. He said you called him directly." I had never called him once in my life. She started crying again, a different kind of crying than before. Not the shock of her husband's arrest, something older and deeper. "I thought he was taking care of things," she said. "I thought I was taking care of you." I believed her. I want to be honest about that. I believed her. Not because I had to, not because she was my daughter and I was supposed to, but because I had watched this man operate and I understood, by then, how carefully he had arranged everything. He had needed her cooperation and he had manufactured it. She was not innocent. She had signed documents she should have questioned. She had taken money she should have refused. But she was also, in the truest sense, a victim. In the end, the charges against my daughter were reduced through a plea arrangement. She cooperated fully with the prosecution. She provided documents, records, testimony. She sat across from investigators and answered every question, and did not once try to protect the man she had married. Her sentence was 12 months of house arrest and 2 years of probation, along with an order to make restitution on the portion of funds she had directly accessed. Her husband, her ex-husband by then, because she filed the papers from her mother's old bedroom in my house where she had moved while she waited for the process to end, received 4.5 years in federal prison. The Penticton property was more complicated. The sale had been improperly authorized and the transaction was reviewed, but the legal process to recover the proceeds took a long time and I will not pretend it fully resolved itself cleanly. Some of the money came back, not all of it. What I got back more than the money was something I hadn't expected to want. My daughter spent those 12 months in my house. At first it was awkward in the way that things are awkward when you are two people who have hurt each other very badly and are not yet sure how to be in the same room. We ate dinner together mostly in silence. We watched the news. We took walks along the lake in the evenings, the same walks Helen and I used to take, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't. Slowly, over months, something shifted. She told me about the early days with him, how quickly it had moved, how he had seemed to anticipate every doubt she had and answer it before she could voice it, how he had introduced her to a version of the world that felt bigger and more exciting than anything she had known, and how that world had made her feel, after 2 years of grief, like she was finally allowed to be happy again. She told me she had pushed aside things that hadn't felt right because she was afraid that if she questioned him she would lose him, and losing him meant going back to the smallness of grief, and she couldn't do that. I told her that her mother had always said grief makes us hungry for things that feel like the opposite of loss, that we reach for brightness because we've spent so long in the dark. She cried when I said that. I held her hand the way I used to when she was small and had bad dreams. There were still hard days. There were days when I thought about the account statements with the zeros, the voicemail on my phone, the deed to a property in Penticton with my signature on a transfer I had never agreed to, and I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but some combination of the two that I didn't have a name for. There were days when I thought about the years of careful saving, the RRSP we had started the year my daughter was born, the money that had been meant to carry me through the rest of my life, and I didn't know how to feel anything useful about any of it. But there were also mornings when I came downstairs and found her in the kitchen, making the same coffee the way her mother used to. And we sat at the table together and talked about nothing in particular. And I thought, this is still my daughter. This is still my family. Whatever he took, he did not take this. She moved into her own apartment in Kelowna about 8 months after her probation began. A small place, modest, nothing like the life that had been promised to her. She works at a property management company. The irony of that has not escaped either of us, and she is careful with money now in a way she never had to be before. And sometimes she calls me in the evenings just to talk, and I always answer. I am 64 years old. I am managing. The retirement I had planned for looks different than it did 4 years ago, before any of this. I am back doing some part-time consulting for a credit union in town, which I did not expect to enjoy and actually do. The house is paid off. Helen's roses came back beautifully this spring. I want to say something to anyone listening to this who has been through something similar, or who is worried about the people they trust with the things they've built. I know how it feels to look at someone you love and believe completely in what you see. I know how easy it is to sign something because the person asking you has their mother's eyes. I know how quickly a reasonable precaution can become a door that the wrong person walks through. Do not stop trusting people, but trust carefully, the way you'd check a beam before you put your weight on it. Talk to your own lawyer, not the one someone else recommends. Read every document yourself, and if your heart hesitates, even for just a moment, even when you think you're being foolish, listen to it. The morning I found out, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, looking at a screen full of zeros. She did, but so did I, eventually. We both did. That has to be enough.